Hi, this is Amy
and Melissa. We are a couple of retired Texas teachers who are CALTs, Certified Academic Language Therapists. We started our own businesses, and now we have a podcast called
The Dyslexia Duo. So join us for our informative podcast, where we'll delve into dyslexia, covering the topics that affect parents, therapists, teachers, practitioners, and anyone who wants to learn more. We'll guide you through everything you need to know, from the first signs to the intricacies of dyslexia curriculum placement and beyond.
This season, we will cover the referral process, what to expect when your child or student is dyslexic, the generational impacts of dyslexia, and how to support those affected.
Come join us! Let's resume our conversation with the insights of Lisa Bowers.
There are challenges with the identification process of dyslexia. I think one of the challenges I've witnessed myself is that, one, of course, people don't know enough about dyslexia even still, but two, the warning signs. And I know I talked a little bit about this earlier, but I think that with a speech delay, knowing that speech can be a phonological processing disorder as well, what are some of the things that you could say to teachers, some of those collaborators that we're looking at? What are some of the early warning signs, not even just teachers, but even counselors or principals, people that are actively involved in an IEP meeting, that are thinking about students on a daily basis, looking at them on charts, looking at their little reports? What are some early warning signs that a speech deficit may be indicative of a phonological processing disorder like dyslexia?
Yeah, we talked about articulation disorders, right? That they're really that motor planning problem. And I mentioned, but we haven't talked about, and this is a great place to kind of add, that phonological processing are tied to articulation. And oftentimes, at least in our assessments, it can almost be phase 1, phase 2. So we look at the articulation in isolation. Do they have these sounds of the English language or whatever language is being assessed in initial, medial, final position? Then what's their overall intelligibility in discourse or conversation? And then we take that information and we overlay it, or in some assessments, or in another assessment, it's just a different procedural to see about the phonological processing disorders. And so they're connected, but the phonological processing disorder in our world, in order to have that diagnosis, is really when you see the rules of sound patterns, they have an error in the rule. And so this could be final consonant deletion. So they're just deleting those final consonants. It's not just that they don't have F in the final position, but they don't have F, they don't have voiced fricative V, they don't have that one either. They don't have G in that final position, but they do in the initial. So that would be an example. And they're inconsistent, right? Depending on if it's initial, medial, or final. And so that's one of those hallmark characteristics of the phonological processing disorder. So I'm going to be a lot more worried about that phonological processing disorder when it becomes a sound pattern and it's broader than just one or two speech sounds, particularly the ones that Amy talked about that are really those hallmark ones that we see a lot, S and R. They're just two of the most difficult, and some of that's because of their saliency. Some of it is because, what you can or cannot see. And then S is high frequency. So if they've had a lot of ear infections or maybe some conductive hearing loss, that's going to be one that is going to be a little bit less consistent, that they've had that sound and then that motor feedback. So I'm a lot more concerned when we're seeing a pattern than I am when we're seeing these articulation errors. So that's one thing that I would say. And I think if we can't establish those consistent patterns in their speech sound development, you can just, it doesn't take long before you're just looking down the road. And again, once you make this a much harder task by introducing that sound syllable correspondence and those orthographic patterns, it just becomes that much more difficult for those kids who don't have those sound patterns well established. So that's definitely one place that I see is just low hanging fruit.
I wonder, I hear all these kids that they talk so cutely, and they'll say, I had talked to a student recently and he said, well, my teacher's moving. And I said, well, to where is she moving? He said, well, she's moving to Iowa. And I was like, oh, I haven't heard of Iowa. And I said, is it Iowa? And he said, no, it's Iowa. And I was like, oh, okay. Well, that's an interesting sounding place. I wonder if she's going to like it there. It just was so cute, but totally lacked all the ability to hear that I was saying Iowa. He was saying something completely different. And he was adamant that it was Iowa. I was wrong. He was right. And I just think it's very interesting to think about, if I'm a classroom teacher, thinking about those different sounds that are just come from speech, that maybe that could be some things that they could think about too. What are they saying? Are there mispronunciations that are kind of a red flag? Is that something that's pretty common too?
Yes. So I love your example. In our world, my daughter is 8 and she still says Pacifically, and I don't want to lose it. Like, it's going to be Pacific forever. We are always going to be very Pacific, and I don't want to lose that. And you see that sometimes too. That's a unique one because that seems like that was a word that was new and he heard it once and that he internalized it that way and could not make that distinction. And so in that case, I get parents a lot, or at my age, it's a lot of my friends who have kids in that sweet spot of the age range where you're getting a little nervous. And I would equate that to, again, like reversal of letters, right? I'm sure that's the first thing that people say to you, like, well, it's supposed to be a B and they wrote a D. Do they have dyslexia? And so we have to go through like, yes, that is an indicator. And also it's developmental too.
Appropriate. Yep.
And because they have an inconsistent representation that we then need to make consistent and explicitly distinguish between those two. And so for that kid, he heard it, it was new, he internalized it that way, and he wasn't really amenable at that moment for you to disrupt that internalization that he heard from his teacher. And Iowa probably isn't something he's heard or has any background knowledge, so there's nothing for him to, with that disruption in, is that what it was? He probably hasn't seen many TV shows on Iowa or cousins in Iowa. And so there was nothing else in his background knowledge or in his linguistic context to think, maybe I got that one wrong. So if it's in isolation like that, it's the same with the reversals. He internalized it and then it solidified that way. And that's how he is expressing it until he hears it, hopefully. But if you give him another word and the same thing happens, that's when I start getting the same with, if you've given that distinction between B and D and you've been very explicit, and now we have these two distinct letters and you're still seeing it. Okay. When we move past this is developmentally appropriate and we're seeing that we cannot distinguish between these because there's an inconsistent pattern that we've developed either in what we're hearing, we can't distinguish, or what we're writing. Then I start getting concerned. But it's the same thing in speech, right? We hear the same thing. And I'm never going to correct my daughter to say, no, it's specifically. Because I want that one to live on.
Yeah.
We still say some of the cute things our son said, but he's 25, almost 25. I was going to
say, we do it to our kids too. And they're, you heard me, chronologically adults. So they don't appreciate it. Let me just put it out there. But let's talk a little bit about some of your research about how spelling facilitates reading in the spell to read approach. What can you tell us about that?
Yeah, I love spelling. I get really kind of fired up when I see how little we spend time. When you look at research that shows we only spend, a very small percentage on time. When you hear people say that spelling is obsolete, it doesn't mean anything because we now have word processing and spell check. And spelling is really a foundational skill that is reciprocal, just as language is reciprocal with literacy, and literacy doesn't happen without language. Spelling is really a skill that is also reciprocal with reading. And so that's kind of what the spell to read approach is really trying to demonstrate, is that spelling is a window into, and one of the best windows we have really, into being able to observe the linguistic processes how that student is internalizing them. So decoding is great, encoding is great, but spelling is really showing us what that internal representation is to that student expressively. And so I think it's a great diagnostic to look at how are they processing what we're teaching them in the decoding process. And it's just fascinating to me that sometimes it doesn't get that interest or support from others. And a lot of my work in spelling, I should say, too, came years and years ago. As I said, I also worked with individuals with hearing loss, but I had this really unique opportunity when I was in my graduate program to work at a state school for the deaf with colleagues and collaborators in deaf education. And I was on the team to help them with the writing. They had personal narratives and expository text to analyze using software that we use in our field, but they didn't really have one that was kind of the similar. And so we were taking these writing samples and coding them using this system. And I was just gobsmacked, fascinated by the spelling of these students who were in 6th, 7th, and 8th grade who all had hearing loss. And they were using what's called CWE, strategic and interactive writing instructions throughout the year. And so we were looking at the progression of their writing skills. And they were so excited about the increase in higher level thinking. We were looking at just word usage and increase in function words and all of these different things. And they were just so excited about the writing outcomes. And I was just laser focused on spelling. Like, do you guys not see the spelling?
Right.
And they didn't. And so going back to interprofessional education and practice, they didn't see it because they were so used to the spelling of deaf students, which I was not. And so in their wheelhouse, that was just kind of what spelling looked like. And for me, that is not what spelling looked like. And so we analyzed the spelling. And in fact, they were using very different linguistic strategies for how to spell. And they were using spelling that was not phonetically consistent. That's what we would typically see. As you guys know, in our developmental progression, we would see students who are spelling incorrectly, but it's phonologically representing all of the sounds. It's just not the right letters or the right orthographic patterns, right? And then from there, you're going to see those orthographic patterns really solidify in this really developmental, again, progression that we would see these orthographic patterns that they're able to use. And then you see how they're able to add morphemes and get to much complex spelling patterns. And so it was just fundamentally different with our kids who were deaf and hard of hearing. What they were using one letter to represent an entire word. Well, of course they were. Some of them were signing. And so one sign is a concept. So one letter was a concept to them.
Oh, okay.
You do not see that with typically developing kids or with kids with typical hearing, where they're going to put one letter. They don't do it. So they were using letters that were visually similar to the sign.
Yeah.
Right? We also don't see that. So that's what kind of got me fascinated with this, again, window into how we spell can inform what we're using for instructional purposes when thinking about reading and decoding, and then vice versa. As we learn those patterns, we should eventually see them in our spelling. And a lot of it is the same as we think about receptive and expressive language, right? Our receptive language is usually better than our expressive language. But then as we express more, that increases our receptive language. The same thing with spelling. We're going to see a little bit of a lag, but we can use what they're writing to inform our strategies for reading.
Absolutely.
I just don't know why people don't think it's important.
Well, and I feel like there's a disassociation between reading and spelling, at least in some, not all classrooms, but in some, you have the kids, maybe they have this beautiful reading curriculum that they're using. It's OG based. But then they give them spelling lists that have nothing to do with anything, and it makes me a little crazy seeing that.
Yeah.
Or they send that list of words that are all of the ways you could spell O, or all the ways you could spell A, and it's got all the irregular patterns included in that.
Yeah.
It makes my brain hurt when I think about that for our dyslexic students, and they sit in classrooms like that where they get these spelling lists and then they have to try to practice that at home. It just makes my heart hurt for them. It makes my brain hurt for them because I know how difficult it is.
That's even worse, right?
Yeah. I can remember when I was a classroom teacher and we were doing whole language and they were basing it on social studies. And my second graders, they gave us the list and one of the words was penguin in Antarctica. And I was like, how often is this coming up in what they need to know? I mean, this doesn't even make any sense.
Yeah, I was going to say, that's even worse, where I get kind of jazzed up when spelling is just, oh, that's a skill that we don't need anymore. That doesn't matter. Or we don't have time. I mean, I understand time too. I'm not a classroom teacher by training. And now that I work with them, I have even more respect for how you get 30 little humans to look at you and sit in a chair, because I didn't receive any training for that. And I don't know if training would have even helped. I don't know. You might have to have some sort of something to work with. But so I understand that there's a lot and why they would get such a little time, but that's even worse when it's not even connected to the reading curriculum or what's being taught for the reading, that it's then just so esoteric or completely out of left field and not connected or tied. I don't even know what's worse. Like at that point, I might even say, maybe it's better to not.
Yeah. Yes, I agree. And I have several students who come to see me privately and they bring their lists, and I've actually talked to the parents, because now I'm in the private setting. You can't just go and talk to the teacher. You have to kind of talk through the parents. So I'll tell the parents my concerns. The parents will go and talk to the teacher. So then the teacher sends me what the words are, and I'm supposed to pick words that are more accurate for their ability level, which it works out fine. But I still think this could be so much easier if there was just better instruction for classroom teachers overall. I feel like it would be best if we would meet the people on the lower, that like Amy says, the lower hanging fruit, meet them where they are, and then also find ways that we can get the kids who don't need as much heavy instruction, get them where they're more self-sufficient and they're able to do more things on their own. Give them some things to work out that are more challenging. Why are you giving such challenging work to these kids that are already struggling every day to get through literacy assignments?
I love that. And I love hearing how you are advocating for that accommodation for your student and working with the teacher. And again, collaborating together so that now you have words that are appropriate for your student that can support the work that you're doing privately and also support him in the classroom, and maybe elevating that teacher's awareness that these words are going to, again, I don't know about be harmful, but are not supported with the instruction that he's at and at his level or her level of learning. And so that's just a great way, again, to kind of help that teacher with those expectations, have that accommodation, which they are certainly able to utilize. So it's not that we're not thinking that spelling is important. We're just having them spell words that are at their level that they can be expected to spell with the level of instruction that we're at right now.
Because the more often they're able to successfully make those connections, those letter sound correspondent connections, the more they're going to be able to transfer that over to their reading and then back to their writing, their spelling. I mean, it just is, it's a full circle approach, and it is so much more effective for them than to just randomly give them lists of words that...
Because that's memorization. Which
it is memorization. Yeah, and because what can our kids do? They memorize. A lot of them can memorize it, pass the test. Maybe not always pass it, but at least get pretty close, or, and then the next week you ask them to spell that same word. It's gone. It doesn't make any sense. It does not make any sense to deliver it like that. So you're a professor, and that's just kind of throwing that out there, I realize. But what do you think needs to be done at the pre-service level for our teachers to help improve the readiness for going into schools, going into public, private, charter, whatever, education? Because I think it's better. I do, because you heard me say when I went to college, it was whole language, and it was all whole language. And I walked into a classroom, honest to God, not knowing what to do. I had a bunch of sixth graders who were children of migrant workers. And I thought, oh my gosh, what do I do now? I had nobody, no computer to get on, because that was the 91. And, I didn't know what to do. Do you think we are better? Are we the same? What do you think about teacher readiness programs now as a whole?
So I always go to my mom with these questions because I was fortunate enough to be raised by an educator who has her master's as a literacy specialist. And she always gives a great perspective because I think, to your point or your lived experience that you shared, I think we have to know where we've been to even consider where we're at, to know where we're going.
Yeah.
And my mom, as an educator, talks, and she was middle school. And she was the first person to say to me, I didn't know SLPs did anything with literacy. That's so fascinating. And again, so that mindset. So she talks about the pendulum, that things swing, or I'll come to her like very excited about something. She's like, oh yeah, we did that in the 80s. Or so she gives me that humbling of that. This is not everything that is new is new.
Right.
So I think we've done a pretty good job. You know, I tell my students, because I think where I came in to the conversation as professional was No Child Left Behind. Right. And so one thing that I talk about is there was a lot of negative experiences with No Child Left Behind. It had some very negative unintended consequences. But from my perspective as a speech language pathologist, it really shined a light on what we're doing in special education and included those kids in a way that they had never had any sort of expectation for growth in the public education system. And so I think, kind of to your point of where we were, where my mom started when she started in the 70s, and then where we were in the 80s of whole language. And then there's always this reading wars kind of comes up, or does, where are we with reading wars? I think a problem that I see as someone in higher education is a over-reliance on programs, right? And that's, I think, sometimes our fault as instructors, of that the programs, this curriculum is given, and that's that's not a teacher problem, right? The district says you have to do this. And my mom talks about, I remember in the 90s when they gave us this curriculum, they said, this will be great. Every classroom in every school in the entire district will be on lesson 12 on this date together. Mm-hmm. So that every kid is getting the exact same instruction. So that mindset, again, that was great mindset of every kid gets the same thing, but that does not play out well in reality because every kid doesn't need the same thing. Mm-hmm. And so I think we're doing a much better job, in my opinion, of training professionals to know the elements that are critical for success, particularly for reading. My colleagues, because I ask them in elementary education, talk about how when they were trained, there was a lot of emphasis on methods and pedagogy of like behavior, like I talked about behavior management of a classroom and what we do in the classroom, and not so much what we get in our world as speech language pathologists. We have an entire class on phonological development. We have an entire class on language development. So there's a reason that just by training that we understand that from the birth history, case history, medical history is going to inform how you're doing academically. And I think teachers sometimes are trained, maybe you can't even ask those questions, right? Because of HIPAA. You shouldn't have access to that knowledge or can't have access to that knowledge. And so they aren't thinking about how that might influence that child or that student that's sitting in their classroom. So I think we're doing a really good job with that, with teacher education. I think state standards, there's a lot of state laws on what needs to be included, again, at the standard level. I think when we get too much into prescription, that's when we take away that the expertise and the knowledge of our educators, and nobody likes to feel that. Right. That I'm not important, that this binder could do the work and anyone could implement this binder. So you have to have both. But I would love to see more professional development that's relevant to everyone. And I think that this is a great space for that. Again, buy-in, because again, you don't want at the table just all of the people with 30 plus years. So having everyone learn with and from one another and bringing that excitement and humility for trying new things is really helpful. And having those critical thinking skills and knowledge, but providing the space for vulnerability of maybe the way I've been doing it wrong, or the way I've been doing it is wrong, or maybe the way I've been doing it has some elements that are right, but I can always grow. I hope that kind of answers your question. That's always my role.
Yeah, I think that's really good. And it kind of made me, because I always have to biographize. Always. I'm a a QI. And so I'm training teachers to the therapy level. And in this last seminar, and they're used to working from a curriculum. They're like, okay, what are we going to do? And I'm like, today you are putting the curriculum aside and you're writing complete reading and spelling lesson from beginning to end based on this objective. And they're like,
yes.
And I got a lot of frowny faces. And I was like, because your goal to be a future therapist is you're on a desert island and a group of your kids are with you. You need a stick in the sand to teach them.
Yes.
You shouldn't have to be weighed down by a curriculum. You should know what's coming next and how to remediate for that need. And so I kind of made me think what you were saying about that's the goal for all CALTs, really. It's not just a curriculum, but to move beyond a curriculum, move beyond a program.
And curriculums are great. I love curriculums.
Yeah.
But if you're trained on the curriculum and you're not trained on the elements that are necessary and you cannot critically evaluate what pieces, like the curriculum can help be a support, particularly when you're new. Novice.
Yes.
But if you're not able to be agile and adapt or be able to articulate to a parent or a colleague or even the student, like if you want buy-in from a fifth grader, you better be able to tell them, why am I working on this? And if you don't know that and you just say, well, because that's what
it says to do next. Yeah.
That fifth grader is, and that's what my mom would tell you too. And I learned really quickly because I love middle school and I've loved your podcast talking about adolescent literacy. And we need to do a better job with thinking of this as K-12, not thinking of it as K-2 or K-3. When thinking about the elements of learning to read, you're going to have to get buy-in to get some sixth grader to do what you're asking them to do. And that curriculum is no buy-in. It is you, and you can use that curriculum as a tool. But if the curriculum is driving it, as you're saying, if that's all you know to do is the scripted curriculum, and you're not able to be more agile and flexible and not only support, but articulate the elements as to why they're critical, you're going to struggle. And I remember that feeling. I remember doing things as a therapist. And I tell my students that if I didn't feel confident in it, or sometimes I'll have a slide that I've written because I've gotten it from somewhere, and I'll look at that slide now and say, do I really know what that slide is saying?
Right.
Because if I don't, I better learn or I need to take it out.
Right. I totally agree with, and I know I'm only saying right because I can't come up with a better word, but I completely agree with that. And it's almost like for some folks, a curriculum is a security blanket. Don't take it away from me.
I get that.
Because, and I get it. And I totally agree with what you say. When you are first starting off, yes, you need to understand, you need that curriculum for the understanding of the structure and the order of presentation and the scope and sequence and all that. You need it for that. But start to let go a little bit in order to be more prescriptive.
And I tell my students that, you're talking about being a professor. When I walk in the class, I say, I know you're not going to like this, but I just have to warn you that everything that you're going to learn in this class will probably be obsolete in 15 years, particularly my class on hearing loss, because the technology is so rapid. And the same with the science of reading, like our understanding of reading and how the brain works when learning to read is just moving at lightning speed. So I say, everything you learn is going to kind of be obsolete. What I'm teaching you is to critically evaluate the knowledge that we have, to know where we started, how we got here, so you will have a roadmap for being able to understand as we go forward. And I tell them, you're the ones moving us forward.
Yeah.
So that's what I'm trying to instill in them in that course, because what I teach you, I hope you're not using the strategies as they're taught today 10 years from now, because if you are, I'm not doing my job.
That's a good point.
We'll be right back after a word from our sponsors.
Hi, this is Melissa with Kids First Dyslexia Services. I am excited to share with you my private practice. Kids First Dyslexia Services is a private practice that specializes in dyslexia therapy. Each one-on-one session focuses on instruction specific to your child's needs in a nurturing environment that develops self-esteem, builds confidence and fosters a sense of accomplishment, resulting in happier kids with higher levels of achievement. We provide a professional, personalized experience, always putting the child first. We value the relationships with both our students and parents because strengthening skills and overcoming hurdles to achieve desired goals and success is a team effort. For more information, please visit www.kidsfirstdyslexia.com. That is www.kidsfirstdyslexia.com.
Hi, this is Amy Rodenroth, and as part of the Dyslexia Duo podcast team and owner of Discovery Dyslexia Services, I want to talk to you about my business. Our COUT-trained team offers expert virtual or in-person therapy located in Prosper, Texas, using proven dyslexia curricula like Take Flight, Build, MTA, Alphabetic Phonics, and Reading by Design. We also provide crucial independent evaluations and advocacy services. Don't wait. Empower your child today. Visit www.discovered.com to learn more. That again is www.discovered.com. Discovered, covering all your dyslexia needs. Let's return to the show.
Okay, it's going to be a little bit more, we've done some really in-depth talking here.
Yeah, we have. Oh, my goodness.
I'm going to go a little bit more. I know we're running out of time, but I want to go a little bit more kind of quirky. Are there any snake oil myths in communication sciences like there are for dyslexia?
Oh, yeah. Dyslexia is loaded with it.
Yeah, we got a lot of myths. So I've recently heard that if you get your tongue tie clipped, if you had a tongue tie that is impeding your speech development, if you get that clipped, then maybe you'll become a better reader. Is that true?
Wow. So that's an interesting one. I think that there are definitely some myths. I think the first myth I'd like to dispel is that SLPs have no place in literacy intervention. That is a myth. For sure is in
that's a good one.
Our standards, our roles and responsibilities, in our accreditation, and certainly have the training because, as we talked about too, language is the foundation for literacy. So when you're talking about speech to print, we're right up there in the mix. For tongue tie is so interesting because that in and of itself is just a hot topic. Do you clip? Is it, what are the benefits? Is it a thing? Is it not? I think talking about developmentally, so no, I can't say that there's any evidence to my knowledge that is that direct causation or even a correlation. If you get your tongue clipped, you will be a better reader. That just is such a far stretch as far as like a causal statement. I can't imagine that there's any evidence. There's none that I know of, and I'd be hard pressed to think there is some, but I'm going to give it a good search here to back that up. But what I will say is that it's not that we have structure and function. We talk about that a lot in speech language therapy, that you cannot fix function if you don't have the structure. Right. So with kids with hearing loss, if you are expecting them to use listening and spoken language as their primary mode of communication, they have to have access to sound. So they have to be using hearing technology, obviously, because they have a hearing loss. They can't do that on their own. They have a hearing loss, so they have to be utilizing technology, whether it's a hearing aid or cochlear implant, behind the bone anchored hearing aid. Some sort of hearing technology is going to get them access to sound so that they can use listening and spoken language to communicate. You have to have the structure. So with articulation errors, not necessarily phonological processing, but with articulation errors, you have to have the structure of the speech mechanism in order to have the function. And that starts with breast support, right? So you have to have good breast support in order to then have good vibration with your vocal folds, in order to be able to move the muscles of the mouth, in order to constrict that air in the way that we're trying to constrict the air to make speech. So co-articulation. So all of that structurally has to be there in order to have the function of speech. And tongue tie is one of those structural things that if you do have a constriction, in tongue mobility and movement. First of all, what we're more concerned about, particularly for the newborns and infants, is feeding and swallowing.
Yeah.
If you can't coordinate suck, swallow, breathe in order to efficiently and effectively either use a bottle or nurse at the breast, you are going to have real big problems real fast, right? If we're not getting the nutrients. So we need the nutrients. And if there is restriction of the tongue, then that's why we would want a clip. So we have that mobility so we can have that motor planning of suck, swallow, breathe. We don't want them working hard in order to express milk, either at the breast or from the bottle. And neither is better. So for literacy, again, you're just taking that road from where we start to where we go. If there is a restriction of the tongue that's not necessarily impacting them with feeding or swallowing, but is restricting them, and you see it a lot less, right? With articulation, then they're working harder for those motor planning processes.
Mm-hmm.
So they're working harder for that. So there's more cognitive load to coordinate the muscles if there is restriction of the tongue. And so then, you know, you could take that down the line and say, well, there might be a reasonable argument that that difficulty might then carry over into that. Now we're trying to take those speech sounds to literacy. I just think that's a stretch. If you even saw evidence of that, I just can't see it being a huge, like, critical mass of kids who are having this problem. But it would make me wonder, you know, not causation, but we're not tracking or even looking at those medical histories of kids. So we don't even know.
Interesting.
Right? We don't even know how many kids with dyslexia have a clipped tongue or don't, because we, in the academic setting, we don't necessarily have access to those medical records, and no one's even asking the question or paying attention to who had that done in infancy. And what I've learned about restricted tongue and tongue tie is, you know, why is it coming up today? Why are we hearing so much more about it than we did? Well, one rationale that I've heard in our field is because there was so much more bottle use in the 70s and 80s. That, which I don't remember, but my mom talks about how she was an anomaly with her friends for being someone who breastfed her babies. That was just not something that was done in the late 70s, early 80s. So, you know, that shift in what's going on in society is then shifting. Well, we're seeing more problems with tongue restriction. Well, it's because it is more difficult from the breast than it is from a bottle. So when it comes to tongue restriction, you're going to see more, not that it's more difficult, but you're going to see more impact with that restriction than you are bottle, because there's just so many ways that there's so many bottles out there.
Yeah.
If you haven't had it in a while, it's quite overwhelming. So that's a long answer to that. But again, it just goes back to what we talked about before, that there's so much there that is, we're humans. It's the human condition, and it's all interconnected in a way that we've kind of tried to isolate in a way that's not facilitating our understanding of the whole person and all of their development.
Fascinating. I really like to hear that. I say it's kind of snake oily, but it just was interesting when I heard this recently, and I was like, I would just love to hear your take on it. So thank you.
It can't be like that directly. Like, if you cut, then you'll be a better reader. That is not a thing.
Yeah. That seems to, if you do this, then this will happen. You know, it's never a straight line. You know, that's my feeling. So I know I'm watching the time, but I have a question here. Can you share with us your study that evaluated child-centered play therapy for at-risk students? What were the measures? What were the results? And how do you think we can start implementing play back into our school day?
Oh, I love play. So that was a really interesting study that I, again, was part of an interprofessional team. So child-centered play therapy is counselors who are registered play therapists. So it's an extra certification that counselors can receive, where they can use play therapy as a tool for working with their kids, specifically with trauma or behavior. And so that study was really designed to see as a preventative model for kids who were at risk in these areas. And we used a protocol that the teachers completed, and we were looking at task orientation, social skills, how they worked with students' assertiveness, aggressiveness. And so looking at these areas, the teachers, if they were at risk, but they weren't showing overt signs of aggressiveness that needed an immediate referral, then they were given play therapy from counselor interns. And then our students were doing a lot of the data collection. And of course, I was part of the team that was looking at play therapy because I wanted our students to see how counselors use play. It's very different. So for registered play therapists, they have a room that's very intentionally filled with different types of toys. So they'll have like a sandbox or some sort of sensory area. They'll have toys of aggression like swords or hammers. They'll also have a play dollhouse with little people. So they have the little people manipulatives. They'll have art crayons that they can play with. And they just are allowed to play in however they want. And that play is their language to work through their behavior, trauma, if it may be newly diagnosed with dyslexia and how they're feeling about that. And so they're just in this room playing. Whereas with speech therapists, the way we use plays is a little more directive, right? We have our goal and objective. We want our area to be very cleared of any distractions. And we bring in our toy that we're going to use because we're going to use that toy to hit our target goal: receptive, expressive language, articulation, literacy, whatever, written language, whatever it is. We're using those toys very specifically, and they're allowing the students, counselors, to use them to show a window into how they're feeling. And I've seen this work, and it was fascinating to see how much expression you can get when you just follow their lead and allow them access to all of these different types of manipulatives to use as their opportunity to express thoughts that they might just not have the vocabulary or the language to be able to express. So that, I think, is a really neat piece. Again, going back to that interprofessional education and practice, understanding the function of counselors and how they're using play as a tool in a very different way than we would as a professional. So the outcome was, after these students received play therapy, we saw marked improvements in all areas. And this is teacher perception, and the teachers knew, of course, they had to know who was involved in the therapy as well. So there were some limitations in how we collected the data, but the understanding of having those kids be able to talk about and communicate what was important to them and what they were struggling with, you saw that the teachers at least perceived there was an improvement in task orientation. There was a decrease in their assertiveness. There was an increase in their positive social communication and interactions with their peers. What I found, and this is another piece that I added to the study, was I asked the question, how many of those students, because we screened all second graders in one school. I think there was like 150 of them. I can't remember the exact number, but how many of them who were screened had an IEP for speech and language, and then how many of them qualified? And what we found was almost all of them, 8 out of 9 who had an IEP for speech or language qualified for the services. So they were at risk for these adverse behaviors as identified by the teacher, and also had, and we didn't distinguish between articulation or language, but they didn't have any other additional diagnosis. So they weren't in special education services as the primary for autism or intellectual disability or any. They had no other diagnosis other than just speech as the primary. And so it just kind of, to me, shows we need to have the counselor involved in the conversation as well. At that school, we were meeting the counselor, the speech language pathologist at the school, and then our team from the university. And the counselor was not going to the special ed meetings. After this project, she started attending those meetings and was like, oh my gosh, I can't believe how much overlap there is from the students that are on my radar in counseling that are there with IEPs who are being seen for services. And I thought, well, yeah. And she just started being part of the team. So just being part of this study, we changed the culture of that school because that counselor saw her added value to those special ed meetings, but she never saw herself as a special ed because that she's not identified as special. They're not in that IDEA. They're not considered that group. And so she wasn't attending those group meetings And we just had this barrier that just did not need to be there. And so that school now has the counselor involved in all of those conversations. And they saw the overlap in these kids are at risk. They're already in speech path. And so the speech pathologist started meeting with the teachers of those kids because they were the ones at risk from a higher proportion than the general population of second grade students. So to your point, Melissa, we're identified. Yes. I mean, if they're on our radar, maybe they're just garden variety articulation. Maybe they just have a little bit that we need to work on. Maybe they're just fluency. But there's just so much more going on. It's so much more complex than that.
It's like your dream reality coming true.
Right.
That all of these different people are involved, and then more people know what's going on with that child so the child can get the services that they need.
And we're not doing more as professionals. We've been able to coordinate and extend, so we're being just more efficient.
Right.
So I'm making notes here, and here's my table. Who should be at the table? The SLP, the counselors, the diagnostician, of course, the parents, the current classroom teachers, and the past classroom teachers, to give that full picture of everything that's, because I was listening to you talk like, yeah, that'd be good. Oh, counselors. Yeah, that'd be good. And I'm, that really should be who's at our IEP meetings or ARDS or IDEA meetings or whatever we're calling them to give that full broad picture of that child, of how they develop, past development, how they've done, how they're doing now, and how we can support in the future.
And I just think about your reach as a QI. What if just one thing you asked those in your meetings, if you said, name one of these people and interview them, or just ask them a question of curiosity that you have about them as a person and as a professional.
Well, shoot, I have to update my syllabus now.
I mean, that takes it doesn't even have to be a learning outcome. It can just be just a curiosity.
Yeah.
Do you talk to these people? And if not, shoot them an email and tell them that you're interested in them.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I think it's wonderful.
It makes such a huge, and it takes all of us to do these things.
Mm-hmm.
We can't just make a change state level. We know the states don't listen to us as educators. Mm-hmm. We have to be the ones fighting on the ground, making the differences amongst ourselves. And of course, we'd ideally make changes statewide, but that's going to take a lot more of us to know what needs to be done and forcing that hand, in my opinion.
I agree. I just feel so energized hearing your stories and lived experience and, the things that you guys are doing. Again, it just like we teach and you teach as dyslexia therapists, right? Explicit, intentional, constructivist. It's the same thing. We just have to be a little more explicit and intentional in our coordination of services. And then we'll have that bigger reach to be able to extend.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I love it. Okay. So Amy, do you want to ask your question?
Yeah,
first?
I'll ask my question first. So you told us at the beginning who you are and things that you've done. Now, this is Dr. Bauer's personal list of things. What books do you recommend? It could be your own. That's fine. Articles, websites, people who inspire you. What would you recommend to others?
Well, as I started with, you guys have already had a lot of the textbooks. So the textbooks that I require for my class, you've had the authors on your podcast. So I always have my students read Overcoming Dyslexia because that one's really, I think it's geared for parents. It gets them out of a textbooky. I always have them read a memoir that they get to choose. So I have a list of memoirs because, again, I think that lived experience is so helpful for them to remember. If you are someone who's never had a diagnosis of any of the disorders, and I hate calling them disorders, I really hope we move away from that, but part of the human condition that needs some additional supports from experts, then I think you just have to listen to their voices. So that's, where I encourage people to go. Our professional governing body, ASHA, American Speech Language Hearing Association, I think is a great resource that would cross-pollinate a lot of the things that are already happening out there with ALTA and some of the organizations, MSLEC. ASHA is a great resource. They have a lot of resources, but they also have what I like that is where if you're looking for articles, they have a search engine that really assists with that. And so I have all of my students use it. It's a free resource, so you can put in, and they have learning modules or kind of brackets for what areas, and they have literacy as one of them. But you can also go and look for if you've got a child with a cleft palate repair, right? That also is having literacy issues. Well, probably because they did not have the structure. So it's hard to get the function. And then once they might have had the repair, maybe they do have some outstanding difficulty with those connections between speech sounds and orthographic patterns. So if you have clients on your caseload that have some of these additional disorders, ASHA's got a really good mechanism on their website that you can look up by disorder and kind of see some articles and some information that can be a little bit more specific for that population. And you can put in those you can put in literacy and cleft palate or, any item. And it will, instead of Google giving you 2 million in 0.5 seconds, which can be a little bit of overload, it's a little bit more curated.
Not to mention, a lot of the Google articles you sometimes have to filter through what you have to pay for and what you don't. So
Yes, exactly.
I know that ASHA is also part of, in the ALTA, if you look on for the membership side, they take CEs from a lot of the ASHA organizational things. Yeah.
Oh, I love that. So you can find some of those resources that would also count for your continuing education units.
Yeah.
We work hard on our end when we do any professional development to make sure that we have ASHA and then also special education through, I think, Council of Exceptional Children, I think might be the one we use. So we try to make sure that we have those supports as well. And I'm lucky because we have many people on our staff here at the University of Arkansas. So we have a QI in training who's also a clinical instructor. So I think that piece is really helpful too, to kind of just have those connections with the supports that we're providing. Supervisors, I try to get away from the academics is one thing, clinical education is another. Like, it's all the same thing. And then our community partners who are community preceptors who are also providing that valuable instructional piece. We're all on the same team, going back to collaboration. So just, you don't even have to be different fields. That education piece really needs to be coordinated as well.
Nice.
I think you guys just provide such a service, and I'm so thankful that you invited me to the conversation and invited the speech language pathologist perspective, and that other people might reach out to their SLP who are your audience, or maybe now your audience will grow and have more SLPs. I don't know. Maybe they're already out there. So I love that.
I learned so much. I've always been intrigued by how speech interacts with dyslexia interventions. And I am so thrilled to learn as much as I learned from you. I didn't know all about how birth develops, how everything develops all through birth and everything. It just is so fascinating to me. And I think about how, oh my gosh, what if something went wrong in developmental phases in, the infancy that led to this development later? Or was it because they were born, they had the neurobiological deficit to begin with, and that's why their mouth didn't develop properly? Like, it's just, I don't know. My brain is just spinning right now with all the possibilities of what it is and what it could be. And I know people like you are way smarter than I am. So I look to you guys to tell me all of the information.
Well, I think that's just where, again, when we value each other's training, SLBs are never going to be the dyslexia therapists, because we're not dyslexia therapists necessarily. I mean, unless we specialize that way, right? And so kind of get our master's degree and then go that direction and say, this is what I'm going to specialize in addition to being an SLP. But we do have that, right? That training across the lifespan. So it is helpful when you don't need to know all of that, because you can use your SLP as the resource to kind of walk you through that for individual and learn the pieces that are relevant to what you're doing in dyslexia therapy.
Yeah, it's wonderful. I'm glad that we had this opportunity to learn from you. And I will definitely be reaching out to more speech therapists who share students with me. So thank you.
Like the best outcome. I love that.
Yes. Okay. So here's my magical question.
It's a magical question for sure.
Okay. So if you had one wish that you could grant for our students, what would it be and why?
Are we talking about students who are diagnosed with dyslexia? Like your
Either
kiddos?
diagnosed with dyslexia. I know you have students who you see in a different way. I know you have,
or maybe even that
students
overlap.
Going through college, or the
College
overlap.
student.
Anything
Yes.
that you feel like, whatever your student is that you want to reach.
I know. I always think about that because we've got the K-12, and then we've got higher ed, and then I consider myself a student. You know, I'm a lifelong learner. I'm learning right now. I feel like a student from you guys, and, you know, even preparing for this and listening to your podcast. So I think we're all students. So I think that's one thing that I would say. But one thing I would wish for them, and what I wish for all of us as we are in this together, is that we see ourselves as lifelong learners, and that we're all continuing to grow and develop, and that development doesn't stop. And so what we're providing to K-12, well, and to the point of like the show, what's happening in birth to 5 for those learners is influencing K-12, which is influencing how we contribute to society, whether that's going right into the workforce or getting some skills through training in trade school, or going into higher education to learn from a college environment. Whatever that is, that progression, we're all part of that developmental process and lifelong learners. And so as part of the human condition, I wish that I had seen myself that way. Yeah. My younger self, like I wish that on my younger self. I wish I had more grace on my younger self. And so I try to provide that as we're all moving through this thing, human condition. And I'd love to see our mechanisms for our kids treat them as part of the human condition and not disordered, different, delayed, deficit. Yeah. But also maybe not necessarily special. Like we're all just people, right? Mm-hmm. It's not like I'm not highly specialized because I'm blah, blah, blah. I'm just me. And you're just you, and we're just all doing this thing together. And so I wish that for our kids. I wish that for every 6th grader, that they just knew this is part of the human condition, right? And whether you have dyslexia or whether you need differential instruction in another way because the classroom doesn't provide that for you, and you need additional support because you're advanced from what the curriculum is given. Like all of those are unique and valued collectively. And I always wish that for my students, kids with hearing loss, the same, that they just feel part of that connection. So that's my wish kind of for all of my students in college, my own kids. I think about that for them too. So
that's beautiful. That gave me chills. It really did. Thank you for that. I love that insight.
That's wonderful. All right. So we're going to go ahead and sign off. So this is Amy.
And Melissa.
And we're the Dyslexia Duo. We'll see you next time. Thanks, guys.
Bye.
Bye. The Dyslexia Duo podcast hosts are Amy Rodenroth,
Melissa Dean.
Our producer is Greg Rodenroth.
You can find us on Facebook at The Dyslexia Duo.
Email us any questions or comments at thedyslexiaduo@gmail.com.
Awareness is so important. Share this podcast with your friends,
family,
and teachers.
Thanks for joining us.
Bye.